More than $1 billion in aid has been pledged for Afghans as the United Nations warns their country is facing a looming humanitarian catastrophe. The plea for global support was made at a donors' conference in Geneva following the Taliban's takeover last month. Even before it seized control of the country, fighting had forced more than 500,000 people to flee their homes. Sarah Morice reports.
Cash-strapped residents in Kabul have resorted to selling their belongings at markets to try and make ends meet. Since the Taliban took over, the price of basic goods has skyrocketed and unemployment has increased dramatically. Life is becoming more desperate by the day.
I brought my household items here for sale because there are no jobs and we have to sell our goods, otherwise we would not eat. We sold these items today, but now that they're gone, I don't know what we will sell next.
Even before the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan was heavily reliant on foreign aid. Much of that has now been frozen. But opening a donors' conference in Switzerland, the UN Secretary-General warned Afghanistan is facing its most perilous hour and urged the international community to give the country a lifeline.
Today, 1 in 3 Afghans do not know where their next meal will come from. The poverty rate is spiraling and basic public services are close to collapse. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes. Many people could run out of food by the end of this month, just as winter approaches.
After 20 years of foreign military operations in Afghanistan, many nations feel they have a moral obligation to continue helping the Afghan people. But distrust of the Taliban means some fear the money will end up in the wrong hands.
My appeal to the international community is to find ways to allow for an injection of cash in the Afghan economy, allowing the economy to breathe and avoiding a collapse that would have devastating consequences for the people of Afghanistan.
Qatar's foreign minister and his French counterpart also met on Monday. They agreed it was too early to consider officially recognising the Taliban as a government, insisting the international community is waiting on the group to fulfil its promises to protect human rights.
We believe that insisting on the issue of recognition right now is not going to be helpful for anyone. What we believe can be helpful and can be more constructive is to engage with them to make sure that the commitments that they put forward will be implemented.
The international community is now in a race against time. The money pledged on Monday actually has to materialise, and then the aid needs to get to Afghans. And this all needs to happen before winter arrives in just a few months. Sarah Morice, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, let's speak to Jens Laerke. He's the Deputy Spokesperson for the United Nations Office for the Co-ordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and he joins us now from Geneva. Thanks so much for joining us on the program, Jens. The UN had made an emergency appeal for $606 million to address the most pressing needs for Afghanistan. You've managed to raise almost double that. Are you happy with that outcome?
Hello, Oscar. I'm happy to be on Money Talks and talk to you. Indeed, it was a very positive day yesterday here in Geneva. We got, in fact, now when we are counting all the numbers up and all that, we are actually getting closer to $1.2 billion that was announced yesterday. I think it's important to stress that what was announced yesterday is both for humanitarian action inside Afghanistan, also for support to those refugees who have crossed into other countries. Some of the funding that was announced is also going into development. So one needs to make a distinction. We indeed had a flash appeal, very urgent flash appeal for life-saving humanitarian action inside Afghanistan for about $600 million. A lot, we hope, of that $1.2 billion will go into covering that. But there is a bit of homework that we need to do with the donors to actually unpack what all these very generous pledges actually mean.
Yes, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says poverty rates in Afghanistan have spiraled since the Taliban's takeover last month. The UN World Food Programme says about 14 million Afghans are on the brink of starvation. Can you tell us how soon will the money that's been pledged materialise? And tell us more about how that money will be spent. You mentioned refugees, for example, but what else needs to be addressed in the immediate future?
There's a whole range of things that needs to happen now in Afghanistan. They are facing a collapse on all fronts. As you rightly mentioned, an economic collapse on top of decades of conflict, displacement. There's an ongoing drought. They have seen 2 droughts, very severe droughts in just 4 years. There are huge amounts of people who are in need of some basic life-saving services. The money that we are talking about now is money that is coming directly for donors into aid agencies operating on the ground. And I think it's important to stress that there's a direct link between the donor and to the aid agency, be that a UN agency or an NGO. We're working, of course, with a lot of NGO partners. The flash appeal that we put out just before the conference is, if I might say, the instrument by which the donors can fund projects that will then go directly into buying food. As you mentioned, the food pipeline is breaking, but that's not the only pipeline that's drying up. We also need a lot of other services and relief items to go into Afghanistan. I'm thinking particularly about health, medical equipment, medicines, malnutrition is very high among children, and we need to get all of that rolling and very fast.
But the UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has said that the Taliban has already broken some of its promises it's made pertaining to women's rights. For example, the Taliban have ordered women to stay at home. They've also blocked teenage girls from going to school. Why then should donor countries and other organisations pledge money to Afghanistan, given that such a regime is currently in place?
The money that is pledged and the money that we help get to Afghanistan is exactly not going to the regime. The money is not channeled through the Taliban. None of the money will go to the Taliban. The money will go directly into helping the civilian population. Now, the concerns that have been raised, and absolutely human rights concerns, particularly for women and girls, are very, very top of our agenda. And our human rights colleagues are right in pointing out where girls' and women's rights are not respected. We have had a mission into Kabul. We have spoken to the Taliban leadership. They gave us originally oral assurances that they would allow us to operate independently and freely across the country. Sunday night, we got letters with these promises in writing. That is a good next step, but it's still early days. As humanitarians and also human rights people, of course, what matters is what actually happens on the ground. Are people being protected? Are rights being protected? And will our aid get to those who need it without hindrance? That is still something that remains to be seen, but we are hopeful that we have some of the resources, a lot of the resources actually, in terms of money, and we have at least some solid commitments from the Taliban that we can make this happen.
Okay, Jens Laerke from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much again for joining us on Money Talks.